Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time you happen to be watching this. I hope you're having a great day. Today's video is The Many Deaths of Laila Starr, Book 4, Part 4, whichever you prefer, Chapter 4 even, Conversations with God. As always, all borrowed images and quoted text are used for educational purposes. It should be obvious by now that I'm not a professional YouTuber, and it also should be obvious, I hope, to all the YouTube bots that I'm not trying to monetize this video. It is just for students in my class to have a way of catching up with what I hopefully lectured on in class. I'm going to begin with one of the questions I had the first time I read through the book was, is this a thing? The only Chinese temple left in Mumbai, was that actually a thing? And if you Google it, there are lots of places that mention it. TripAdvisor even tells you how to go about getting there. But this joinpaperplanes.com talks about the caretaker and the fact that the temple is, in some ways, two temples. The ground floor is a shrine to the goddess, and the upper floor is a shrine to one of the Buddhist gods. And there's some differences between the two. Obviously, Laila Starr must have been dealing with the upper floor. The chapter title, as I said earlier, is Who's Conversing with God? And on the left, you can see Laila questioning the temple, saying God, and the temple replying no. On the right, you have part of the conversation that Darius has with Laila Starr. And so I'll ask you again, what kind of god were you? And there she informs him that she used to be the goddess of death. We have these two conversations. And the fact that there are these two conversations, I think, is important because throughout this section, throughout this chapter, throughout this issue, whatever you want to call it, there seems to be a lot of layers about who's doing what and what's the nature of everything. And so I want to talk about those layers, those questions, or at least the ones that I had as I read through it second, third, and fourth time. Question one, it seems to me, is how does one converse with God? The temple, the thing Laila addressed as God, said, would you like a blessing? And Layla's got these really weird little confused responses. I'm okay, so no. I'm not really sure what to ask for, which implies that maybe she's thinking about what to ask for and therefore she's not okay. And then to go one step further, there's this blessing slash favor sort of thing, as if a blessing has to be this huge, big thing that's given out, and the favor is more like, can you help me find my keys? And there seem to be a lot of messy connections. Going back to Layla slash Kali's conversation with Darius, I used to be a god. I was just a student. Then I died a few times, and now a God lives within a body. I mean, I live within Layla's body. And so, am I God? Am I human? And Darius is confronting a God he thinks, and the God thinks she might be human. And it's kind of a bunch of messy connections. So, how, based on these messy connections, can Darius converse with Layla Starr? Can Darius converse with Kali? And it still goes back to the messy connection of how does one converse with God, period. And those messy connections lead me to a couple more questions. So, is Layla Starr, and by connection all of us, a little divine or a little human? When she talks to the temple, she says, I'm Layla Starr. I used to be the goddess of death. Then I got fired. Then I died a few times. You don't need the details. But I seem to have this connection with the spiritual side of things. I can hear and talk to crows from issue 2. I can hear and talk to you. I seem to be able to do this thing because I'm a little human and a little divine. And she was jumping back and forth between being Laila and Kali earlier. Here, she clearly identifies herself as Laila. And then she jumps back to this idea of she's only got a little part of humanity. So is she a little human and a little divine? Is she a little divine and a little human? And those conversations she had with the crow get brought back up again. The conversation she had with the temple earlier in the issue comes up again. What allows her to have this conversation or these conversations? Is it her humanity or is it her divinity? And I think by extension, Ram V wants us to ask, what's that to us? How are we fitting in with that? And his answer might be a lot different than the answer you get in BLI, but I think this is one of the things that the book wants you to think about. In class, the first question I'm going to ask today is what do you talk about in BLI? And I think at some point, the question of what is our relationship with God, and is there a spark of God inside of us, might be a couple of things that come up. We had the connection with God. We had Layla slash Kali trying to deal with who she was just a few slides back. Now we've got an angry Darius, but reminding us that we mortals don't work without each other. And so not only are we a connection of how do we converse with God, we have this connection of how do we interact with other mortals? What's the proper relationship to do that? And how do we learn to work with each other? And why is it that we seemingly are social beings and we can't work well without each other? There seems to be an effort to kind of go in circles in this book. And in book 2, there was a lot of discussion about memories. And memories come back here in issue 4. The memories are immortal. That seems to be a big part of book 2. And Darius argues that they refine themselves to perfection over time, and that refining is why he can recognize Laila Starr from when he was 8 and from when he was 20, and now that he's 36 and she hasn't aged a bit, he still recognizes her. I do think, and I don't know if BLI handles this, but there is the tangential question of what's the nature of memory. But certainly the implication in issue 2 and the implication here in issue 4 is that one of the things that provides a sense of immortality is the fact that there will be memories. People will remember us. Laila touches on that by being upset that the article doesn't mention her. There's no mention of Laila Starr. And Prana reminds her, sometimes that's how you go, unmentioned and nameless, which creates a problem if memories are eternal and the way people retain a certain amount of immortality is through memories. Again, I think BLI might have a different interpretation of that. But nonetheless, there is this kind of question of how do we deal with getting a sense of immortality if it's possible to go away, to die unmentioned and nameless? Book 1, we talked about fate. Fate was linked to Darius. He was going to be the child born on the 12th day of the 12th month. He was going to create immortality because that's what fate had for him. And as fate would have it, he's once again linked to fate. He's got everything anyone could ask for in a lifetime. He's got some money, he's got a little bit of fame, he's got a lot of stuff. In book one or book two, I can't remember which, I talked about the nature of myth. And one of the things that a lot of myths point to is that the efforts, especially the ancient Greek myths, point to that efforts to escape fate push people right into the fate they were trying to escape. And I hope I said Greek myths before, not Norse. Anyway, in the ancient Greek myths, that happens all the time. We see Laila contemplating the same thing. I pushed Darius into this whole immortality business. I was trying to escape the fate. I was trying to avoid the fate. I pushed him in. I'm the one who made the fate happen. It's one of the big things that seems to happen again in those Greek myths. And I think Ram V just pulled it out and put it here, reminding us that efforts to escape certain fated things, like death, seem to just push us right into the fate one more time, the thing we were trying to escape. He goes to point out again the fate and choice. Layla in book one, you know, was taking things into her own hands. Here we have Wei in book four taking things into his own hands. He stayed. Many people left, even, they went back to where they came from. Things changed. The city was perhaps less welcoming. He stayed. He made some conscious choices to stay. And because of that, all of a sudden there were some natural consequences. He stayed so long that his Mandarin isn't very good. He can speak the languages of the people around him. And so he's asking a big question: where am I going to go? I'm an old man. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Since I can't think of anything else, I'm going to hang around. I'm going to take care of this temple. I've got no place else to go. This seems to be something I can do. There were natural consequences. I chose to stay. And now the natural consequence is I'm here. I think Ram V in this book does a great job of getting to kind of the messiness of life. We've got this fear, not of death, not of a physical threat, but of a life full of emotion, full of questions, and we're really, really, really short of answers. So Laila, Starr, Kali, whichever you want to, is confronting that thing. And as Laila is kind of a representation of the human side of things, I think that's a big chunk of the human side of things. Trying to figure out answers to some of those big questions, dealing with the mess of emotions, dealing with all of that. And we compound things. We mix in some guilt. Is it our fault? Is it truly our fault? Are we going to take the blame for something that's not our fault? We mix in the guilt. We're going to add a little grief. It's just going to happen. We can't go through life without it. And so you've got some guilt, you've got some grief on top of all those big existential questions and the little questions like, what am I going to buy for lunch? And you start mixing them all together. And am I going to have enough money to get this, or this? We got a crap ton of questions: physical, spiritual, emotional. And then you toss in the grief, you toss in the guilt, and it just kind of keeps piling on. And eventually you get to the point where there's some either self examination or self recrimination. Socrates, talked about the unexamined life. Looking at yourself seems to be something that should happen. But when you're screaming at yourself about, what makes you so special, or having other people scream at you what makes you so special, it might lead to that bit of self recrimination. And although Darius's point is that nobody gets a second life, a third life, a fourth life, whatever it is, most of us in life get a second, third chance, something like that. So the self recrimination maybe prevents us from looking at the fact that there might be a new chance, there might be a new beginning, there might be some answers to those questions. And so, to go back to Socrates, to go back to the ancient Greeks, to go back to Aristotle in particular, perhaps this is a thing where we're going to talk about extremes and avoiding the extremes. That self examination should not go to the extreme of self recrimination. Self examination should also happen. We should not avoid it. We just shouldn't avoid the lack of never looking at ourselves, and we should avoid, the lack of never looking at ourselves, and we should avoid recrimination, taking that looking at ourselves to the extreme and blaming us for everything, or blaming ourselves for everything. Sorry for all that stammering there. We get to see the art work here. We see the grief. We see the look for how do I solve this grief? How do I solve these other questions? The conversation with God for Darius was not very satisfying. And you see the book, Art and Science. I talked in class about one of the great things about comics is they don't have to preach to you. Sometimes they can just show you. So one of the places people look is art, literature, whatever all else, philosophy. The other place people seem to look is what are the scientific answers to all of these big questions? Darius is an innovator, so he was more than likely looking to the science end of it. And when he screams at Laila / Kali that death is never going to bother us again, he's obviously looking for a scientific way to deal with that situation, to end death, to create immortality. But when people look for answers in arts and sciences all the time. And the biggest question I think this book asks is, did you find what you were looking for? Not only what are you looking for, which I think will come up here in just a little bit, but did you find what you were looking for? And I think a extension of that, and maybe even a bigger question, how do you find what you're looking for? And once again, I would guess that a lot of you in BLI, there's got to be something in there about how do you find what you're looking for? And sometimes I think one of the things that Ram V does very, very well, and maybe it's a way to get through life a little bit, is use a dad joke. I came here looking for something. I think I'm lost. The human condition that Laila Starr has in this all of book 4 is the condition of being lost, of having all of these questions, not knowing the way, not knowing the answers. But in the meantime, let's look out the window, say the name of a Chinese character who dies later in the book, and have her sort of looking for the way, looking for way. And I double checked with my stepson, who spent a lot of years in China, 5 or 6 years in China, and is pretty good with his Mandarin. And he told me the pronunciation would be the same way you would have Whey, Whey, Kurds in Whey. And if that's the same, then WAY also works. And then there seems to be the absurdity. We're going to go back to, the institutional religion, the absurdity of these deities, not being able to handle the disruption of Laila Starr. I knew she was going to be up to no good. Institutionally, should I send a memo? Should I organize a rule? Should I make something really important to fix this? Or let's just make it personal. She's a vindictive little. And there's just the absurdity of the gods not being able to handle the situation. And I think laughing at life's absurdities is probably one of the things, again, that Rob V might suggest is a way to get through all of the tough questions Laila Starr's asking. And let's add one little more level of absurdity. Book one, Layla's been there for an eternity. She is an eternity. She is this cornerstone of the pantheon. But right here, we're going to treat her as if she's a little too young. She doesn't even look like she's of drinking age. Let's just keep throwing the absurdity upon absurdity upon absurdity. And certainly, in one of your classes someplace, you should have come across the term Kafkaesque. Ram V isn't quite going that far, but he is certainly trying to make us laugh at the absurdity of the situations these characters find themselves in, and by extension, we find ourselves in. And let's add one more inside joke. The temple that got destroyed, that caused Layla's fourth death, was after Storm Kali, so death kills death. It's a nice little inside joke. And again, I think layers are important in this whole conversation. I hope I've helped explain a few of them. And remember, the question for the paper is, what does BLI talk about? What does BLI say about any of those things? And if BLI has something about absurdist humor, feel free to throw that in the paper as well. Hope all of you are having a good day. Hope to see you all in class the next class period. And I hope that this has been an enjoyable read.